Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Now, what's really cool is research has been done, and Hofstede has basically looked at different cultures from different societies based on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different indicators. The indicators are power distance index, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance index, long-term orientation. So for example, power distance index, it's the degree less powerful members of an organization and institutions accept that power is distributed unequally. It's the distance between the most powerful and the least powerful person in an organization. So traditionally, if you look at Asian culture, Asian society, power distance tends to be really high. As in what your boss says, they're really powerful. In a country like Australia, it's a lot more equal. You can go tell your boss that they're wrong. You might not have a job, but you can still tell them that they're wrong. They're not going to be offended by it as such. Individualism, and the opposite of which is collectivism. This is the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. Now, this one's a really good one, right? Every culture is very different. Traditionally, Asian cultures, Latin American cultures, I would say even Mediterranean cultures, they're very collective. When we do something, we don't do it for ourselves, we do it for us. Not just our family, but for our society or our community. Whereas the individual is the opposite. And some cultures are very, very individual, where what they do, as in success, is seen as what you achieved, not what we achieved. And this really has long-term effects on the decisions people make, how they behave, and also what is seen as success. So it's an important one to consider. Masculinity, the opposite being femininity. Yep, femininity. It's the distribution of the roles between the genders. Uncertainty avoidance index, so it deals with a society's tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. It indicates to what extent a culture programs its members to feel either uncomfortable or uncomfortable in unstructured situations. So also a really interesting one to look at. And the last one is long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. Now remember, all of these different criteria are different ways of looking at a particular culture. We are generalizing when we are using something like this, because remember, every society, every country, every culture is made up of not just the collective group, but also individuals. And culture being a living thing, it evolves and changes over time. However, by generalizing and looking at something like this, the Hofstede's cultural dimension, we get a good overview of what a particular country's situation could be like, which allows us to go, okay, if we are going, say, from Australia to India, or from India to Thailand, or from Thailand to Italy, or Italy to France, or France to Colombia, Colombia to Japan, it allows us to go, okay, when it comes to communication, when it comes to us exchanging an idea, interacting with each other, these things help to guide what the likely scenario, situation, or outcome could possibly be. Okay, let's compare a few countries based on Hofstede's insights. So let's go Australia, let's go Italy, let's go Thailand, Colombia. All right, so the blue is Australia, the purple is Colombia, Italy in green, and Thailand in orange. The first indicator we're looking at is power distance. Power distance is the distance in power between the most powerful and the least powerful person within an organization, or culture, or society. In a country like Australia, the power distance is quite low, meaning there isn't that big of a gap. I remember when I first came to Australia and I was playing cricket at a cricket club, I called up my parents and they were like, "How was it?" And I was like, "Oh my God, you won't believe it. Out here, you've got a lawyer, a doctor, a plumber, an unemployed person, all standing together, having a drink after a game, having a conversation. Like for me, it was a huge cultural shock. And it's because the power distance is so minimal out here, meaning there is no difference between someone who has a lot and someone who has little. You can walk up, have a conversation, have a discussion. You could go to your boss and tell your boss that they are incorrect. And it's not a big deal. So very low power distance. We can see that Colombia has the highest in terms of power distance out of these 4 countries we're looking at. Now, of course, if you change the countries, you're going to get different results. But Colombia, in this particular case, has the highest. The second one is individualism, meaning the individual versus collective. Now, this particular one's interesting. The higher the score, the more individual. Lower the score, the more collective, meaning more community, more society. As we can see here, Australia has the highest individual score, meaning people in Australia are more individualistic, less thinking about society, less thinking about community, more thinking about themselves. Whereas Colombia and Thailand, a lot more collective in how they operate, thinking a lot more about the people around them, the society around them. So if I was to do something, before I do it, how will this affect the people around me? And that has a big impact on the decisions they make. The third criteria, masculinity. This one's really interesting. Italy is the most masculine country in the sense, in Italy, the power that lies between, or the difference in power between men and women, men have a lot more power. It's a lot more masculine. Whereas Thailand has the lowest in terms of masculinity versus femininity. If anything, you would say in Thailand, women have a lot of power. So masculinity is substantially less, and the respect for women is a lot greater as a result of which. The fourth criteria, uncertainty avoidance. Now this one's really interesting. Uncertainty avoidance. Here we're talking about one's ability to accept risk or avoid risk in this particular case. The higher the score, the more uncertainty avoidance. The lower the score, greater uncertainty avoidance. Meaning if you've got, say, Colombia with 80 out of 100, it means that they don't like taking risks. Australia with 51 out of 100, it means they're okay with it. Sometimes they'll take risks, sometimes they won't take risks. So really interesting. Italy at 75 and Thailand at 64 out of 100. Long-term versus short-term orientation. In this particular one, the higher the score means the more long-term you think or more long-term orientated you are. Really interesting to see here, Colombia, from a cultural perspective, has a more short-term tendency. So the decisions they make is a lot more short-term. If I'm going to do this, what will happen tomorrow? If I'm going to do this, how will I benefit? Whereas Italy is the opposite. Italy is 61 out of 100, meaning compared to, say, Australia, Colombia, and Thailand, there are a lot more long-term thinking. So if I do this today, how will this benefit me in the future? Not the short-term future, but more towards a medium to long-term future. Now remember, depending on the countries we choose and the countries we choose to look at, the data that we get is going to be very different. Okay, last one is indulgence. Indulgence is the amount of time and, let's say, money spent on indulgence, the luxury, the better, the finer things in life. Here we can see Colombia is winning with 83 out of 100, meaning Colombian society is a lot more indulgent. The lowest is Italy. Italy is 30 out of 100, so they're a lot more frugal. When it comes to spending, now, of course, there is exception to every rule. I mean, Ferrari, Lamborghini comes from Italy. When it comes to fashion, there's some really big fashion houses out of Italy. But at the same time, if we look at their overall society, and remember, with the Hofstede's insights, we are generalizing. We can see that Italy is a lot lower compared to, say, Australia, Colombia, or even Thailand. So it's very interesting. How does all this help us? Well, let's say we want to communicate with people in these countries, or let's say we want to set up a store or an office in these countries. By understanding the culture, it allows us to change the way we operate, to change the way that we select the strategies which we use to communicate. If we were, let's say, in a country like, let's say we were in a country like Australia, and we said, hey, if you invest in this today, 50 years from now, you're going to see benefits. That's not going to work in a country like Australia or Colombia because they're not very long-term orientated. But if we were in Italy, we said, hey, if you invest in this today and 50 years from now, your children and your grandchildren will benefit, they're more likely to say, okay, that's not a bad idea. Like, let's do this for the future. So it really depends on what we're doing and how we're communicating. Indulgence is another big one. If we wanted to ask people to spend money on luxury products, going to Italy and convincing the average Italian person to spend a month's worth of salary on a particular product will be a lot more difficult compared to, say, Colombia or Australia, which are more indulgent cultures based on Hofstede's insights.